actually one of the greatest presidents, in my opinion. I'm curious about yours, Eisenhower. I warned about this when he warned about the military-industrial complex, Dan. You know that speech better than anybody. But he also, in that very speech, he warned of the dangers of a scientific technological elite that was to be put in charge of public policy, or as I call them, political scientists. People that by force of their knowledge are assumed to have wisdom, and then like Fauci, like Francis Collins, people that acted in complete disgraceful manners as scientists towards Jay Bhattacharya and towards Nobel Prize winners and other people, and caused this conflation of scientific elite with political power to suppress and oppress people.
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Brian Keating. I believe you're the head of the physics department of University of California, San Diego. Is that correct?
No, sir, that is not correct.
God damn it.
Maybe someday, if they don't watch this interview, Dan, then I have a shot at making chairman. No, I am what's called the Chancellor's Distinguished Professor of Physics at UCSD. Okay. Which is just kind of what's called an honorary chair in recognition of my accomplishments academically and service and so forth. So yeah, that's my official title, and I'm a co-leader of one of the biggest cosmology experiments in the world called the Simons Observatory, Simons Array in Chile. I just got back from 17,200 feet in the Atacama Desert. We'll get into that, I hope.
Well, we're going to get into a lot of stuff. So, for the listener, viewer out there, we're going to talk about science today. We're going to talk about some of the stuff that's going on in academia, generally speaking, and on social media vis-a-vis, I guess, what you could call the invasion of Socratic meritocracy, right? Because that's kind of what we've seen. Let's just jump right into it. Fuck it. We've seen a lot of the stuff from the Twitter file so far about censorship of one thing or another for some variety of reasons. And, when it comes to politics, honestly, that stuff's intolerable, but it's not something that I wouldn't expect to happen because everybody's got a motive there. When it comes to science and public health especially, then it becomes, I think, quite dangerous for people. And this is something that we're starting to see now. It was I think part of the third release, and there's quite a bit more to come on particularly on COVID policy. But what's the guy's first name?
It's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya.
Yeah, Bhattacharya. Yeah, he was one of the guys who, one, is extremely qualified to discuss these things, and two, didn't toe the party line and was banned for it. I mean, a guy that's positioned quite a bit better than anybody that worked for Twitter to answer these questions was banned from sharing his perspective on it.
Yeah, during the most critical phase, arguably, in the history of COVID, and so I had a chance to speak with Dr. Bhattacharya. Actually, I met him in Italy, in Florence, Italy, which is very appropriate, Dan, because as you know, that's where the Inquisition took place of Galileo, my grand master and my hero in all things scientific. He was basically imprisoned under house arrest in Florence, Italy, outside Florence, Italy, for the last 9 years of his life for the great crime of speaking the truth to power, which was the Galileo affair, where he claimed, rightfully so, that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Sounds benign today, but back then it was revolutionary, no pun intended, and that caused his attention to be. Now, he also was a kind of a political buffoon. The guy was a little bit of a, even more nerdy than I am. He was impolitic. He didn't have the kind of gravitas and grace that we would expect of somebody of his great brilliance. But that brings up, kind of the most clarion called, kind of that I've had in the last 5 years, Dan, is that knowledge is almost anti-correlated with wisdom. In other words, you could be freaking brilliant, win the Nobel Prize, and be a total a-hole, a moral coward, a fraud, and a charlatan. And likewise, you could be, extremely wise, but not have very much knowledge about quantum physics and wormholes and all the fusion and stuff we're going to talk about, I hope, too. So the conflation of knowledge with wisdom has been one of the kind of signal, events in the last 50 years. And actually, one of the greatest presidents, in my opinion, I'm curious about yours, Eisenhower. I warned about this when he warned about the military-industrial complex, Dan. You know that speech better than anybody. But he also, in that very speech, he warned of the dangers of a scientific technological elite that was to be put in charge of public policy, or as I call them, political scientists. People that by force of their knowledge are assumed to have wisdom, and then like Fauci, like Francis Collins, people that acted in complete disgraceful manners as scientists towards Jay Bhattacharya and towards Nobel Prize winners and other people, and caused this conflation of scientific elite with political power to suppress and oppress people, and almost ended his life. I mean, it's an amazing story.
It is, yeah, and I recommend anybody that hasn't brushed up on this particular story yet on Dr. Bhattacharya, definitely go check out Brian Keating's YouTube channel. Check out his interview with him and familiarize yourself with this, because as these new Twitter releases come out about the COVID suppression, particularly, you're going to find a lot of crossover in themes, not just for tech and social media, but also within academia itself and within medicine itself. That's right. I guess the way you illustrate this issue and connect it to historical issues of I guess similar import, it leads me to this question: what is the purpose of science? And then part B to that question is, how do motives inside science from outside that purpose negatively affect it? Right. So how does somebody coming in with an agenda negatively affect, like the church and their agenda to maintain the Earth-centric view of the universe, for example? It affected not just the individual Galileo's life or any other scientist that may have been fucked around with because of it, but it's we call this period the Dark Ages for a reason, right? Like, who knows where we would be as a civilization now if that hadn't happened. So anyways, let's start with the first one. What is the purpose of science in a society like this?
Yeah, I'm glad that you didn't ask, what is the definition of science? Because there really is no one definition. Science can be done in many different ways. We all are scientists at one level. We test ideas, hypotheses. We inculcate evidence. We know if we cross the street without looking both ways, as I tell my kids, you're going to get hit by a car. That's a scientific experiment, that you hopefully learn from other people's hypothesis testing before you have to learn it the hard way. So we all are scientists. So there's no one scientific method. In fact, there's multiple ones. I talk about those in my second book, which was written with 9 Nobel Prize winners, called Into the Impossible. And the notion of the different ways that we define science is up for debate, and that's healthy. Now, the purpose of science is very different. The purpose of science is to take in empirical knowledge about the physical universe and use that for the betterment and flourishing of humankind, in my opinion. We are not the stewards only of the earth. We're stewards of human beings, and human flourishment depends on scientific progress, or I should say technological progress. But technology often comes because of basic scientific research. Not always. Sometimes there's serendipitous discoveries. The X-ray, here's a famous one.
Right.
I mean, we didn't study quantum mechanics because it didn't exist in 1896 when the X-ray was invented. And yet it saved countless lives, made my life better, your life better. But that was serendipitous. So sometimes technology, on the other hand, comes from the actual application, like fusion could not occur serendipitously. We couldn't just have like fusion taking place. You can actually have fission taking place. I don't know if you knew this, but in Africa, about 3 billion years ago in Okolo, Central Africa, Congo, I believe, there was a natural fission reaction taking place because there was a critical mass of uranium that would flood and be part of an alluvial chain that would come back and forth, and eventually there'd be enough to form a critical mass that would incite a fission reaction. But fusion that just took place on not a large scale, it's actually a small scale, but on an important scale. That requires technology. That technology required basic scientific research that the colleagues of mine and I do. So the purposes, in my opinion, make life better. explore the universe and answer the fundamental question that only human beings can know. You know, the word Homo sapien, sapien means wisdom. It doesn't mean knowledge. Scientia means knowledge. So don't conflate the two of them. It turns out they can be useful. Like many things that get conflated, they have some correlation. But in this case, the purpose of science is to make human life better in all ways that can mean.
I can't. I want to jump off from here, but I got to go back to this. You said, there 3 billion years ago, and it happened where? I'm taking notes here.
Yeah, it took place. It's called the Oklo Natural Nuclear Reactor, and it took place billions of years ago. I don't remember the exact age. It could have been about 3 billion. Now the Earth is only 4.2 billion years old. Our solar system is only about 4.5 billion years old. And before I forget, Dan, with your permission, I'd like to offer, these specimens of the early solar system called meteorites. So if you're watching the YouTube, you see them. If you're listening on audio, you'll hear them. I want to guarantee I'll send one to every one of your viewership that has an APO mailbox. Hopefully, I don't know if it'll come in time for Christmas, Dan. It depends on when this is out. But go to briankeating.com/list and use your APO address. Full address, please, guys. And I'll send you guys a meteorite because it's a tiny token of what I can do. These are 4.3 billion year old. They landed in somewhere in Argentina, where I was very close to recently. And it's a remnant of the early solar system. I'll send you some data about them that a friend of mine took in a nuclear spectroscopy lab. And it's really fun to learn about these things. So join my mailing list. APO address is guaranteed. And .edu address is guaranteed to win. The rest of you fellow citizens, you'll take your chances. First 100 of you will win.
Yeah, that's good. So Oklo Natural Nuclear Reactor, and it was just a critical mass of uranium. And what happened exactly? I mean, was there an energy burst, or give me some details?
Yeah, so obviously there were no, people around 3 billion years ago to witness it. But what they have noticed on the cave, that it's contained within, is that there's a regular periodic irradiation and transmutation of the chemical elements within that cave that took place periodically, correlated with apparently a flooding of the underground water system, this alluvial system that created the cave, or was contained within the cave. So you'd have flooding, and then there'd be just some chunk of rock. I mean, it's pretty amazing, Dan, right? That you take a chunk of rock. You could do this if you had enough of it. You just take 2 chunks of uranium and you put them next to each other, and you get heat. And with that heat, you can get energy. With that energy, you can then convert it into steam. You can take that steam, spin a turbine wheel, and use what's called a starter generator, and you get actual electricity. So that's how we use fission reactions today. Although, in California, we've been desperately trying to shut down the cleanest form of energy, the greenest. That's how you know they're frauds, by the way, Dan. When you talk to an environmentalist, I don't know if you talk to Michael Schellenberger or anybody like that, but you talk, and he was like one of the Greenpeace founders or whatever. You talk to people like that, and also involved with the Twitter files, as you know. When you talk to these people who are Greta Thunbergs and whatever, they're just fraudulent, because we know how to take cleanest possible energy. It emits no carbon. What's clean? It emits no carbon dioxide. It doesn't rely on any combustion. They won't do it because they bring up this boogeyman of 3 Mile Island, and they bring up the boogeyman of Chernobyl, whereas it's actually pretty amazing. And the 2011 earthquake in Japan, nobody really died as a direct result of, a possible. So people haven't been killed in meltdowns. The Russians, of course, scumbags that they were at the time, maybe still are, they sent people into the reactor, to cover up. And actually, that was one of the first targets, wasn't it? In the beginning of this war, was to secure that facility so they could cover their freaking dirty footprints, literally blood on the hand. My sister-in-law's from that region of Ukraine. Anyway, getting back to it. Fusion is the opposite. Fusion is even cleaner because it has 0 nuclear waste products that are associated with it.
This is a star. So hydrogen atoms under the pressure of gravity fuse together and become helium atoms, and so on and so forth. And each time that happens, it produces energy.
Exactly. So it's unusual that if you combine something together, we're used to blowing something apart. That makes sense. It could give off energy. But actually, when you bind 2 nuclei together, as you just aptly said, that releases energy as well. There's an excess binding energy, it's called. And that is orders of magnitude even higher than the fission reaction. And as you may know, and as your listeners may know, some of them may control these devices, right? You need a fission device. You need a fission device to initiate the compression of a fusion reaction in an atomic blast. So we don't want to do atomic blast for generating energy. So the technology we'll get into later is radically different from that. But the atomic bombs dropped on, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those are used to initiate and ignite a fusion reaction, which is orders of magnitude more powerful. So that's what, the Tsar bombas and stuff. They're not using uranium anymore, plutonium. They're using, they're using hydrogen devices.
Right. So we discussed, that was just nerd stuff for me. I enjoyed that. The purpose of science is ultimately, if we had to distill it down to one sentence, to make human life better, right?
Yes.
And now we see increasingly more people, especially not even just bureaucrats, but people within the science community, physicians, and like you mentioned, Francis Collins. He was the head of the Human Genome Project. I mean, one of the most important pieces of work directly related to human beings ever completed, in my opinion.
That's right.
And now is essentially a bureaucrat that has motivations outside of the general purpose of science. And I think the separation of church and state between political actors and the scientific community is maybe more important than the actual separation of church and state, right? Because if its purpose is indeed to make human life better, and it frankly is probably best situated of anybody or of any group to accomplish that through whether it's through agriculture or through scientific discoveries of other kinds, we've really fucked it up here. And it's hard to understand how it got this bad, to be honest.
Well, I think, my friend Dennis Prager, often says that, the left ruins everything that it touches. You don't see this kind of politicization from the right. And I'm no far right. I'm no far left. Certainly not far left, but I'm closer to, consider moderate. Of course, everyone thinks of themselves as moderate. But anyway, the politicization of science has come purely from one political persuasion, as has the Twitter, kind of suppression, the YouTube suppression. This video that I posted with Jay Bhattacharya, an hour and a half, we're talking about philosophy, we're talking about the Renaissance. It gets slapped with a huge COVID-19 warning, directing you to Wikipedia, which at heart is run by, people of extreme left-wing persuasion. If you look into the Wikimedia Foundation at some point, I urge you guys to do that. And I've stopped donating to them because of that. So when you think about, well, who controls the narrative? There are many different types of science. Look, Galileo was right, but he actually used an incorrect form of logical reasoning or incorrect fact pattern to establish the claim that he made. In other words, he he was right that the Earth goes around the sun, not the other way around, but he used a completely erroneous form of evidence to establish that. And effectively, he was claiming that the fact that on Earth we have 4 tides a day, that was evidence for the simultaneous rotation. Say I take this hard AF seltzer that I'm drinking, and I rotate around the camera around my head. He said that motion around my head, the head being the sun, the hard AF being the actual the Earth, but that in combination with the rotation of the tumbler on its axis, that's total BS. Tides are not caused by that. They're caused by the moon's gravity differentially pulling by the inverse square law on the closer part of the Earth's surface, with the 6,000 mile, 8,000 mile diameter of the Earth. That difference between the close side to the moon and the far side divided by the 250,000 mile distance to the moon squared is actually significant enough to get a 1 or 2 foot change in height of the ocean relative to the 5,000 foot depth of the average mean sea depth. Okay, so he was totally wrong about that, but he was right about the hypothesis. So who's right? Tony Fauci funded gain of function research. He admitted it, right? He admitted it, but he changed the definition. He changed the gain of function is within a bat to make the bat virus, more easy to study or something like that. In the interview with Jay Bhattacharya, I joked, like when I had COVID, I luckily only had it once. Somehow my wife's avoided it. I don't know how she does. She just walks around in like one of those NBC suits all day, I guess. So I haven't gotten to like hold her hand in 3 years. But anyway, when I had COVID, I lost like 5 pounds, and I always joke I dropped 5 pounds from my double chin to my ass. But in reality, can you imagine that there are, Dan, some positive effects? Like you could engineer something so you could lose weight, or obviously you don't want to do it with a pathogen that killed 7 million people around the world. But in other words, that was scientific, Dan. It wasn't ascientific. Fauci's not like some like bumbling clod who didn't know. No, he actually wrote the textbook that Jay studied with, ironically, as a young medical intern, right? So he is a scientist. He understands science. But where it got bad is when he became a political scientist,
right,
and started advocating for politics. And as I mentioned in the interview, at the expense of human life. I don't know if you've thought about this, but there are people, doctors on the left. And one is here in San Diego, Dr. Eric Topol. I had him on my podcast. He was one of the foremost opponents of releasing the vaccine, the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, before the 2020 election, because he figured, rightfully so, that Trump would get credit for that. And that was, in his mind, almost as dangerous at some level. This has been reported elsewhere. I'm just kind of summarizing. I may have some of the facts wrong. But if that's true, and let's assume it is, then people died, right? Because the vaccine, in his mind, what eventually is effective.
Right.
But for political reasons, he withheld it. Or he didn't control it, but he was one of the ones that advocated that it could accrue and accrete to Trump's benefit. So I think that could mean that people who advocate like that have blood on their hands,
sure,
even by their own admission, if they believe the vaccine is flawed. I got vaccinated, my kids did not, and I refuse to get them vaccinated because it's pointless for them. And all studies that we've shown. And actually, Jay discussed that as well. Jay Bhattacharya, he co-wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, which advocated for common sense, strategic application, vaccines where appropriate, lockdown, he doesn't call them lockdowns, they're basically taking the elderly and segregating them away because they're the most vulnerable and letting life go on. Otherwise, there'd be huge downstream effects. Now, he's a scientist. He's actually an MD PhD. So he's not, most doctors, by the way, Dan, aren't scientists. They don't do I hope that they're not. I don't want my brain surgeon, I'm going to do this experimental procedure, because I'm really curious what happens with my hypothesis. No, screw that. I want you to just go down the checklist like a car mechanic, okay? And no offense to doctors or car mechanics intended. But the point is, they're not scientists. They're not testing hypotheses. They're not doing, some are, but your doctor, your pediatrician, whatever is not.
Right.
And that's good.
Yeah, I think so. The United States is set up in a Western manner to have civilian control of the military for a reason, right? Because
Yes.
That the military is a weapon to use in defense of the country, not the country itself.
100%.
But we're in a position now because of the grant funding and public safety and public health stuff that there is a de facto civilian control of science as well. And I can see good and bad parts of that. I can see the bad parts where it's been politicized. I could see the good part if anybody with any common sense would have said, hey, Fauci, maybe let's not do this stuff because it's dangerous. By the way, we outlawed it and you're still doing it. What the fuck's going on here? You know what I mean? A little civilian
Certainly
control.
with pathogens, you're right.
Yeah.
Yep.
A little civilian control may have been a good thing. Why do you think in this case with COVID that people widely flouted common sense and reason, which, by the way, is perhaps the scientist's most useful tool? I realize it's all politics and blah, blah, blah. But this time it was a little bit different than the normal political spin machine. It was forced vaccinations, ostracizing people from society, get people getting fired, people getting kicked out of the military, and all this stuff. Didn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, honestly, that's not how we've ever done things before.
You're absolutely right. And actually, I never thought of it until you said that, Dan. The military, of course, I knew what you said. The president, is a civilian. But it's absolutely correct, because what did they call it? What did we call it originally? We called it the war on COVID. We called it a war on COVID, right? And, you can debate whether or not it should have been a war. It was more virulent, and they were worried. And I urge you to watch this video, because Jay goes through a slideshow that is not to be missed in this video.
I mean, he said in March of 2020, it's like, We don't need to be locking people down. It's going to be old people that are and sick people that are most affected by this. Because the narrative these days is, oh, we didn't know that at the time. It's like, dude, one of the most prominent scientists on Earth told you exactly that a month into this thing, and you shut him down.
Him.
Yeah.
Then they smeared him. No, it's worse than. Imagine if Miley or whoever, and you're serving. Thank God you didn't serve under him, right? But imagine if he called you like a lunatic. Imagine if your command, the soldiers that men are serving underneath you, and they read in the from a FOIA request that he called you a lunatic or a fringe person. And this is a scientist talking to Fauci, and then Fauci agrees with it. Now, it's worse in some ways because if you not only did it hurt him, so like it smeared all the people, all the young professors, all the young scientists of all different genders, persuasions, et cetera, for immigrants. It smeared all of them. They're all tainted. Now, Collins was the head not only of the Human Genome Project, that was successful. He was the head of the entire National Institute of Health at the time. He's since retired, and Fauci's going to retire. But it's almost impossible. Just everybody out there, you work at a car dealership, you work at a construction line, you work for somebody, and then the boss of the company comes down and says, your boss is a scumbag. You don't have as much confidence. And now, what are you going to ask him for a letter of recommendation? Forget it. They're screwed. And this wouldn't have been revealed. They were all doing it in the shadows. And I say shame on them. I think it's totally disgraceful. And it undoes, in some ways, like we believe in forgiveness. Jay's a devout Christian. I'm a devout Jew. Collins supposedly is devout Christian. To do it, and Jay says he can forgive him, but it's going to take time. In Judaism, we don't have the Judaism is more hardcore. We're like, we're not going to forgive until you demonstrate under the exact same circumstances that you would never do it again, and you make public. There's a famous story, a mushal, we call it a mushal, a story, parable about a man who slanders his rabbi. It's called lashon hara, evil tongue is what it literally means in Hebrew. And he says about the rabbi, whatever, and it's true. It's like gossip. Okay, and he goes to the rabbi and says, I feel really bad, Rabbi. I did this horrible thing. I told gossip about you. It's true, but I told that I shouldn't have done it. How can I get repentance, teshuvah? And the rabbi says, just get me one feather pillow. The guy's like, awesome. That's easy. Goes to his house, gets a feather pillow. The rabbi says, okay, great. And the guy says, what's next? He goes, cut the pillow open. All right, if you say so. I guess I lost a pillow, but I'll gain a friend. Cuts it open. And the rabbi says, there's just one more thing, and then you're forgiven. Collect all the feathers. You can't collect all the feathers. Once they're out there in the world, the damage has been done. Toothbrushes and words, they can't be returned once you've used them. Now, you can hope in the Christian, in Christian philosophy, and even in Judaism, you can repent. But these people show no inclination towards that. And the sad thing to me is that most of my colleagues are okay with it. And it's disappointing. Really, Dan, I didn't get into science for the money. I'm a public employee of the state of California. I was a public school kid growing up, and I serve the public now, and I give back through my YouTube channel because I think, scientists that take money from the government, as we all do, we all are beholden to the government for the research and the training that we get in the facilities. So I believe we have a moral obligation as scientists to explain to people like your listenership, and maybe especially your listenership, because many of them are so doing things that we don't, scientists don't usually have the courage to do, like serve in the U.S. military. But anyway, the point is we should give back, and we don't. And so this disappointment with my colleagues has really, it's kind of disillusioned me. If it wasn't the best job, if it wasn't like scratching that itch that I know that many of you and your listeners have, just like so curious about the universe and love. Like, imagine if I could just do that. That's why I got into it, not for all this bullshit.
Yeah, it's really sad, to be honest, and it's but we can't spend too much time contemplating how sad it is because there's still a lot of work to be done. Now, the two most obvious, in my opinion, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but the two most obvious ways in which it's not a new political phenomenon. It's like you said with Galileo. I mean, it's happened many, many times over the course of human history. Copernicus. I mean, it's happened quite a bit. But at least in our lifetime, the the most obvious examples are certainly COVID, especially with the collusion between big tech and government and all this stuff. But then the energy sector, with the, all the propaganda, the alarmist nonsense about the world's going to end in 10 years. It's essentially, what do you call it? Jehovah's Witnesses who incorrectly predict the end of the world every couple of years. And the alarmist stuff surrounding nuclear energy as well, which, as you intimated, is the cleanest version of energy that we have currently. And nothing else even comes close. I mean, Germany had, 15 years ago, I believe they had 6 nuclear reactors in their country that provided the bulk of their energy. They've shut down 3 of them. One was in the process of being shut down. It still is, and they were planning on shutting down the other 2 this year, but have had to stop because now all of their energy comes from Russia, and that's not a great deal, right?
That's right.
So, besides all the political factors, it is in no way a humanist viewpoint that we should irrationally and over quickly switch to renewable energy that isn't ready for prime time. As my pal Alex Epstein likes to say, people don't die from the heat, they die from the cold, right? The vast majority of people who die from weather exposure, it's the cold. I mean, when I say vast majority, I'm talking about 95%.
That's right. Yeah, in human history, and maybe in the near term future, with Europe and on the throes of many different economic, political, and military forces, and just beholden to the weather. I think the scientist gets a long view. That doesn't make them wise, but it makes them should make them appreciate. Now, if you are a true believer, see, I believe, I know you're not like a religious fanatic at all. And you're not maybe even at the level of practicing that maybe I am, but the point is, I think everybody needs a religion or has a religion at some point. Some people it's Texas football. Some people it's environmentalism. Some people it's politics, and some people it's science. And I know many of those types in the latter category. It doesn't mean that they can't also have be actually religious observant or any one of those adherents to the other categories that I mentioned. But the point is, there's something in human nature that almost needs something to worship, as if we have some innate humility, that we know that we sort of have this imposter syndrome at some level, that nobody's the smartest person who ever lived, no one's the strongest person that ever lived, and we're ultimately, the ultimate expression of what sapienza means, or sapien and homo sapien, is that we know we're going to die. Have you ever thought about that? We're the only animal, quote unquote, you think animals, that knows that life is short. Your dog, your cat, they don't know shit, right? They don't know what's going to happen. They could die tomorrow. They could die in 50 years if they're a tortoise. So humans have this unique capacity, and I don't know why. There's only one species. It's very weird, right? There are all these monkeys. There are all these different types of tortoises. There's 1,000 species of beetle that live just in California. But there's only one animal, one species that knows it's going to last only for a perishable amount of time. And so I think because of that, we want to worship something, because maybe we want to believe in a fairy tale or a fantasy that there's some life or ultimate justice beyond. And I'm not going to get into that. But the point is that people believe so strongly that it becomes their identity. You can't separate Jay's Christianity from who he is. You can't separate, my Judaism or my Americanism from who I am and who you are. That's part of who we are. It's our identity. I'm a pilot. I fly little Cessnas around. That's part of my identity. So humans are complicated. And in this situation, I think we have to kind of notice that. The problem is people put so much importance on science and scientists per force because we create so much technology. It's almost a shame. Like, if we only did theoretical physics, people don't say, listen to the mathematicians, right? Because when was the last thing you use higher order algebraic theory? You never do, right? It produces zero useful technology. Of course, for us, it's incredibly important as physicists, even experimental physicists, but it doesn't produce technology. So we worship things that produce technology because of the benefits it accrues to us. And I think, again, that's really dangerous. I mean, just come to one of my faculty meetings and tell me that these are the people that should run the world, and they should be allied fellow travelers with the people that run social media. I'm wondering, what's going to happen with YouTube? I mean, can YouTube, you guys, when I started talking to you 2 years ago, it was one of my favorite interviews, kind of turned the table on you at one point. and that was really fun for me. But you had almost the same number of subscribers on YouTube as you do now. And I'm like, I look to you as like a standard, and I'm like, shit, I can't, what's the point? Like, why am I trying to grow on YouTube, my little channel for nerds? It's pointless. I'm just going to get suppressed and deplatformed, demonetized like you are. So I don't know. Do you have any more hope, Dan? I mean, can you give me any more optimism for, like why I should be putting effort into, kind of social media?
Well, about YouTube specifically, I would say probably not. I mean, if you think about the reach of YouTube versus the reach of Twitter, or the reach of Facebook, Instagram versus Twitter, it's light years apart. I mean, Google is the most dominant website on the entire planet, and YouTube is where most videos are viewed. So
that's right.
You have to wonder how much, if if Twitter can have the impact that we know it's had after all of these releases, imagine what Google's done. Imagine what YouTube's done, right?
Yeah, it's kind of depressing, and then you have to be kind of beholden to it. At some level they own it, and it's their platform. They're sending it out. They're monetizing it for you. If you're lucky enough to not be on their blacklist. At the same token, like I feel there's been a change in the wind, and I predicted this too, that it's going to go from Trump is Hitler, to DeSantis is Hitler, and now Musk is Hitler. It's like literally you're hearing this stuff from people like Kara Swisher and this guy Scott Galloway. I think you've had on your show. He came on your show. He won't come on my show. It's very kind of annoying. This guy, is all he talks about. I mean, Elon is so lucky. He lives like completely rent free in Scott Galloway's mind, and it's all they talk about with Swisher. And she basically accused him, because he put Trump back on Twitter, which he hasn't been on, of the horrific Colorado shooting, being responsible for the Colorado shooting. And then Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro, who she tried to have deplatformed from YouTube. She's a real mendacious person. And this guy Galloway is just like on, just like they're like married, partners or whatever, except, it must be a strange relationship. Anyway. Sure. So, I've invited him on. I'm a professor at a top university, with a named chair, and run a podcast channel and YouTube channel about as big as his. And, just give me a courtesy after 3 months. And I was introduced by our mutual friend, James Altucher, who's a great, gracious mensch of a friend. Guy doesn't respond to my emails for 3 months. I'm like, I've had 14 Nobel Prize winners on my podcast, Scott. I said to him at the end, I'm like, I give up. Best of luck to you in your book. I tried to help you out. Not going to work. And, you keep tweeting about, how Trump is responsible for, the next coming of the Fourth Reich.
Yeah, it's, here's the thing. You're describing multiple different pockets of stupidity here, but it all betrays the same fundamental problem that we're experiencing. So skepticism is one of the most important features of science. It's one of the most important tools you as a human being will ever have in your tool belt, because as soon as we became sentient, we started trying to trick each other into shit. You know what I mean? For at the lower level, from human pair bonding, you know what I mean? Putting out the right signals to get the kind of mate you want. It's not always nefarious, but it is always present. So skepticism is probably the most important feature of human life. And when
it's so interesting you say that. I always say, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dan, but all those things are zero-sum games, right? If you don't get that mate, the peacock next door is going to get the mate. Exactly as you said. If you don't get that mango, the other monkey is going to get the mango. So it's deeply rooted in evolutionary theory. Game theoretic, is part of Darwinian evolution. It's actually encoded in biological evolution. So. But what's different about science isn't a zero-sum game. It's what's called an infinite game. A zero-sum game is like chess. There's a winner and a loser. An infinite game, the goal of the game is to keep playing the game. It's like, when I'm with my kids, I know you don't have them, but like, I don't want to like the game to end. I'm chucking a football to my 10-year-old. No, I want that to go on forever. That's super fun, right? Yeah. That's like one of the best experiences of humanity, I've ever experienced, right? So, but science is comprised of a series of finite games. In other words, there's getting into college, There's getting in, and if you get in, someone else won't get in. If there's getting in graduate school, getting a postdoc, getting a professorship, getting tenure, there's only so many slots. Winning a Nobel Prize. These are all levels of the academic ladder that are all game theoretic. But the ultimate aim of science is not winnable. There's an infinite amount of information. Human mind can only comprehend a finite amount of information. So it's an infinite game comprised of many, many finite games. You're absolutely right that this is ingrained in who we are. And so skepticism is the claws. We don't have the sharpest claws in the jungle, the sharpest teeth. We're not as strong as a moderately aged chimpanzee. And yet we dominated them all. We could exterminate every species on Earth, including ourselves.
Yeah. And it's, here's where that great potential becomes a real problem, when the people in society who we truly need to be skeptical, like journalists and the media generally speaking, and commentators, authors, writers, whatever, and scientists, when these people begin becoming influenced by politics and power, or colluding with politics and power, worse, we're fucked. Like, that's it for us.
Yeah, let's not dwell too much more on this, Dan. I don't want to get too depressed, but I do feel like there's so much good stuff in science. What I want to ask you is, from a layperson's perspective, and you're obviously very well educated, very well read. I got to replace that Neil deGrasse Tyson book behind you with the Brian Keating book. I'm supposed to maybe go on Lex's podcast again in the winter. I'm going to come visit you. Hopefully we can do one in person together. I'd love to see you in person. I'll bring you some books of mine, some meteorites for you as well. But when you see things that are happening in science, do you think that like science is sort of monolithic, or is it redeemable? I mean, there are certain things, like until recently, I didn't think Twitter was redeemable. And it only, by the way, was redeemable because Musk spent $45 billion of his own money. He's going to lose it all. I mean, he's going to lose a lot of it. It's very hard. That's one place where Scott Galloway is right. Doing the math is not in Elon's favor. Unfortunately, now he can take it. But I worry more about Elon, by the way, for the distraction from his ultimate mission, which is getting people off the planet. And that might be because I'm a scientist, but I do realize how much good he's done. I kind of wish he would stop going on Chappelle and you talked about that yesterday. But it's like at a certain point, come on, man, either get back to Mars or get back to Twitter, or just take a fucking break. I mean, the guy's got 9 or 10 kids. I don't think he knows. And I respect the hell out of him. And by the way, he had Jay Bhattacharya at Twitter headquarters just this week to go over the results of the Twitter file, and also look into things like verification. Like, I wasn't verified, for 5 years. I had to keep submitting. Like, I'm a name chair professor at top university. You have my, address at campus. My email. My profile. I don't have that many followers, but whatever. Every time, not significant. And then I'd see some congressman, with pronouns in his bio. Fine, you can do that. From Colorado, running a congressman, whatever, aspiring congressman,
candidate,
or woman, and candidate, and with 50 followers, and they're verified, because they're running, or some like local newspaper, that has 50 subscribers. And I'm like, what's the deal here? So they had a collusion. I'm like, I told Jay, tell Elon that if you have verified publications and peer-reviewed journals, that should count as verified identity. And by the way, someone can't go onto like Nature or Science magazine and use my name because it's verified via my academic institution, and we have social credit scores, so to speak, in academia. Anyway, that's a sidetrack. But ultimately, when you look at science, are you looking to it like with hope, or are you kind of plagued by this notion that the kind of mind virus is going to infect science to the point that it won't be that kind of perception that you have rightfully, and I had for a long time? Are you worried about the future of science as a layperson?
I mean, I am worried about the future of how we practice science, but not science itself. You kind of hinted at it not being a monolith. I agree with that. I mean, I don't even see science itself as corrupted at this point. I think it's just like all the other avenues of life, politics, economics, whatever the fuck else. There's a lot of noise. To me, it's more like a windshield that needs to be cleaned, right? So I can see through it clearly again. But we haven't lost what it is. And I think most reasonable people can see that. They see, I'm going to make some assumptions. I'm going to test those assumptions, and I'm going to spit out the report. And then I'm going to analyze that report. And I'm going to make some more assumptions. I'm going to test those assumptions and go on like that forever, right? And sometimes it will get influenced by politics. For example, if there's a critical, not just politicians, but if there's a critical mass of the public that wants to make it to the moon in 7 years, we can do that. You know what I mean? Using 400-year-old Newtonian physics, by the way, to land on the goddamn thing. There's a lot of stuff that we can accomplish through political will. So I don't think the two things are at odds with one another. I think the intermediary that's trying to capture your attention and trick you into shit, that's the problem. It's not science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's true. And you know, I think the level that a layperson has to know science in order to trust science, thankfully, it's pretty low, right? I mean, I got my kids normal flu vaccine because it was a normal flu vaccine, but it's very different from an mRNA vaccine. So and whatever, I got it, so I can't really speak. But again, there was a lot in those phrases. Everything from 2 weeks to slow the spread. I mean, that all came from scientific forecasting, right? So we've gotten so many things wrong that I believe it's in the best interest of science, to kind of portray ourselves in a more humble, light. And actually, the famous Nobel laureate, Richard Feynman, he said that science should be considered the belief in the ignorance of experts. Mm-hmm. As you said, Newton was right, and all you need is Newton to get to the moon. But to get to a black hole, you need Einstein. Or to build GPS, actually to navigate on Earth, you need Einstein, not just Newton. Because we use general relativistic corrections in the time coding of the GPS triangulation scheme. So that would be impossible. Now, so if Einstein just thought, well, Newton's an expert, he knows everything, experts know everything, right? So no, you have to doubt and you have to question, but you have to do it with humility. And I feel like right now there's not a lot of humility in science, A, because we have kind of drunk the Kool-Aid ourselves, but B, because we've lost the sense of comity and collegiality that used to typify, kind of I can't, I'd like to be wrong about that, but, God forbid we need another Manhattan Project type thing. I don't know if like colleagues, maybe it's so monolithic now, on one political schism versus the other that it wouldn't make any room for friction because everyone just monolithically agrees.
I can't imagine that the bulk of mathematicians and physicists are somehow leftists. That wouldn't make sense to me because they don't think that way.
No, you're wrong. It's totally true. They are.
So how did that happen? I mean, I don't understand. I don't understand how you can be so logical on one side and then so completely illogical on the other. That doesn't make sense.
I think it's, it harkens back to Churchill said, if you're not a liberal, in your 20s, you have no heart. And if you're not a conservative in your 30s or 40s, you have no brain. And I think they've kind of, most people stunt their growth or stop their growth. And I'm not, that's just his quote, right? I'm not saying my colleagues. I mean, I'm not the smartest, one by far. And I always say, you think I'm smart, just watch me try to figure out which letter comes after Q. I have to sing the freaking alphabet song. But that's okay. I have other skills and they kind of marry together in an interesting way.
I always point to Ed Witten. Anytime anybody's like, oh, you sound pretty smart. I'm like, Ed Witten's smart. I'm basically a chimpanzee.
But he's an idiot. But he's a moral idiot.
Oh, yeah.
Because he believes in the Palestinian right to almost self-immolation of the Jewish people. And he believes every single thing reflexively that Noam Chomsky or any of these idiots, and Noam's been a guest on my podcast, Witten won't come on my, so yeah, that's the proof, actually, thank you. That's the proof that knowledge is not equal to wisdom, because he doesn't realize that a state the size of New Jersey in the Middle East, where Jews have come, since millennia for there's no doubt about it. But he believes they should make peace with people that are lobbing rockets and stabbing teenagers in the neck and slaughtering people. And that the famous quote is, if the Palestinians lay down their arms, there'd be peace tomorrow. There'd be no more war. And if the Jews laid down their arms, there'd be no more Israel. And that, unfortunately, they've been giving so many opportunities. And all he does is reflexively retweet Peter Beinart and everything else. So it gives me hope that
it's just
knowledge
like,
is not wisdom.
It's just like the I support the current thing ideology. But it's the most brilliant, at least as far as how human beings generally measure brilliance. It's the most brilliant people in the world that still get captured by this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think so. And I think we worship because of the size of somebody's brain and their accomplishments. We again, every 4 years, Dan, you realize that there's a letter written to the New York Times by 70 Nobel Prize winners plus about why you should vote for the particular Democrat in office. You're telling me that and they've never endorsed a Republican. And then they'll endorse things like Obama's Iran deal, or they'll endorse this vaccine safety. Remember, there was 50 or 60 Nobel Prize winners endorsing Peter Daszak that he shouldn't have the Eco Health Alliance funding be cut, and that was political thanks to Trump. And that was where the gain of function took place, as even now Fauci is admitting. So these are Nobel Prize winners. But by the way, what the hell does a cosmologist who won the Nobel Prize know about gain of function or about the Iran deal? And by the way, some of them have Alzheimer's late stage. Some of them have had to sell their Nobel Prize to pay for their Alzheimer's case. It's despicable the way that we manipulate and use the halo that surrounds these individuals who made a good accomplishment and something that they've done. But on the other hand, they have no moral wisdom to teach us whatsoever.
Sure, yeah, that's a good example.
They may, but they don't by force of their Nobel Prize.
Sure, yeah. It's the way we assign authority to things is very bizarre. So you talk about humility in science. How do you balance humility in science and maintain scientific authority? Like, this obfuscation of scientific authority isn't new. Conservatives used to say that evolution's just a theory, which is at best a misunderstanding of what a scientific theory is. That it's maybe we should just change the language so people will fucking understand it, I guess. But it's been whenever science doesn't intersect with somebody's worldview, they find a way to deny it in some way or another, right? Or obfuscate the truth. Now, how do you and it's a problem. It's like when you're being criticized, it's not always the best idea to capitulate to the criticism. Sometimes you just got to tell people, shut the fuck up. But when you're dealing in ones and zeros, right? When you're dealing with an expected outcome versus the actual outcome in a scientific experiment, then that's data. It's what it is. How do you maintain authority and interject humility? Like, I mean, you have to do that at the personal level. There's no way to institutionally do that in science.
Right. So it's
well,
really,
peer review is supposed to handle that, but it doesn't, right?
Yeah. Not to plug my own books, but my second book, Into the Impossible, is interviews with 9 Nobel laureates. One of them is Dr. John Mather, who's he's actually the project scientist, the main leader of the James Webb Space Telescope, which we talked about over the summer. He and I talked about in the context of how do you listen to criticism and take criticism, as I always say, you want to take the criticism not to your heart, just like you don't want the compliments to go to your head. Mm-hmm. And that's a very difficult thing. And by the way, we as scientists, we never get training in ethics. We never get training in, like, how do you behave morally? Oh, no. Those things are out. Those things aren't as important as knowing advanced quantum field theory. And that's why we teach advanced quantum field theory, but we don't teach moral. I think we have it backwards. I think we don't assume the totality of scientists as being human beings at a core level. And we kind of think of them as automatons with as you say, that deal in zeros and ones. And so but have you ever had a bad result from your computer? Well, if you're asking it to add things up or whatever, even with like GPT chat and all this stuff, you can find huge biases and flaws. And the fundamental thing that you're bringing up is called confirmation bias, which is this huge tendency that human beings have among many of our other peccadillos and lacunae and faults and flaws, that we tend to discard evidence that disagrees with our own chosen hypothesis, and we tend to accept things that agree with it, even though they might be wrong. Like, again, Galileo was right that the moon goes, that the Earth goes around the sun, but his evidence that he accepted confirmed his hypothesis rather than being kind of dispassionately disconnected from it. So John Mather won the Nobel Prize, and he says, how do you get beyond? There's a tendency in popular imagination to think that science is about credit, egos, and politics. In your outreach, how do you get beyond it? My perspective, John Mather says, so we're all in this together. Even if we're competitors, if you're working on a project and I'm working on a project that's supposed to measure the same thing, we don't get the same answer. That's really important. As scientists, our job is to figure out where the discrepancies lie. And a good scientist will look for the discrepancies and not take them personally. Oh, you're off by 3 standard deviations from mine. You're an idiot, you Keating. No, you look for the discrepancies and you take it. Now, most of my colleagues don't have the kind of, mensch-like, perspective that I would prefer that they have, and maybe I don't either. But the point being, it's an endeavor done by human beings, so it'll have all the faults and flaws of any other human endeavor, and that's why this book is written not for physicists. It's actually written for my avatar when I wrote it was a car salesman in Tulsa. Like, how do you deal with like your other salesman, you're competing with him or her, and then you have a boss you have to deal with, you have funding, you have schedules. How do you cooperate, collaborate, and imaginate so that you accomplish great things together, and sometimes, rarely, on your own?
Have you seen this is kind of out of nowhere, but have you seen that show Space Force with Steve Carell?
No, I haven't.
So
I don't watch much TV. It's hard for me to find.
Don't blame you.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that won't land. I wonder if it wouldn't make sense to have, instead of, like when we assemble something like CERN, for example, or which is the Large Hadron Collider, or your project, the satellite arrays, or any of these major projects, James Webb, would it be useful to have, I guess, psychologists or social scientists on board that project to kind of make sure it stays directed in a humanist form? Like, hey, we're still trying to solve problems for human beings, and not even to course correct people that get off course there, but just to add perspective. Like, hey, this thing that you just glossed over because it's not meaningful to your research right now could be big for human beings.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And some of the big ones do. LIGO, so the product placement. The co-author of the foreword to this book is Barry Barish, who won the 2017 Nobel Prize for LIGO, which is the Laser Interferometric Gravitational Wave Observatory that first detected black holes directly colliding together, releasing energy across billions of light years, traveling to the Earth, perturbing the surface of the Earth by less than the diameter of a proton, and measuring that in multiple times, multiple locations over almost a decade now. That team had embedded with it a sociologist of science, reporting and sworn to confidentiality, who wrote books about this. His name is Harry Collins. And there were many others. Jana Levin, who's a good friend of mine, she's a professor at Barnard College. She wrote a book kind of embedded with them as well. And so, yes, and someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's no longer, practicing scientist, he is very good at that, kind of distilling things out, a little bit snarky in his own way, and that's fine. He's been on my show. Yeah, he actually said he called me racist at one point. It was pretty fun. But we, he said, I'm going to play the race card on you. And, it's his inimitable way. But the point is, he's very good at distilling that. Lawrence Krauss is another one who is very good. You should have him on. He has a new book coming out this year. He's, like, by the way, far left, far atheist, but we can have a conversation. It's not a problem for me. And you might enjoy it as well. So anyway, the point being, yes, we can distill the humanity. The problem is the people that will read that book aren't the scientists. The question I have is how do you kind of get the message to the choir? How do you get them to hear the sermon?
Well, that's kind of on, not on you specifically, but on people closer to your position to interject that into the education process at some point, right? Because
I think that's right.
If it's not injected that early, then it'll never happen. You know what I mean?
And that's why I say, like, law students learn ethics in law school. Medical students learn medical ethics. Business school here, we teach business ethics. Different philosophy, they teach ethics. But physics, they don't teach ethics. They don't. Well, what do you do when your advisor for your PhD that has to sign off on your dissertation after 7 years potentially, so that you can be a PhD and then be a professor that signs off on other people's PhDs? What do you do if she says, well, no, you have to publish this thing, these data, and actually I have to be the first named author on the paper because I'm up for tenure review and whatever? This happens all the time. Oh, yeah. How do you know? Like, there's no like priest or rabbi, mediator, ombuds person. There's no one to go to. And it's all just ad hoc, made up on the spot. And so you get a lot of people that have no training in this discipline, with high leverage and low kind of ROI for the time that they might have spent on it, because actually it's not prioritized. Even the outreach that I do, Dan, it's almost it's in some cases it is derided, is like, you must not be that serious a scientist because you're not spending 100% of your time doing science. As if like, raising kids and actually like I'm in this weird state. You're not in the same state because you don't have kids, but I'm like taking care of my parents, and I'm taking care of my kids, and I'm trying to teach classes of 50 undergraduates, and I'm teaching 6 or 7 grad students. And I always joke, being professor is the hardest 3-hour a week job in the world. And that's if you're a real professor like me, not like previous professor we talked about on the podcast. You can tell I'm not like upset about that at all. But the point being, we're in this awkward state and we're constantly looking for money. We're constantly doing hours. And then we have to worry about, are we being inclusive enough? Are we being diverse enough? Are we being equitable? Are we taking advantage? My graduate students right now, Dan, are on strike. They have a union. They formed a union as part of the United Auto Workers Union. Can you imagine like the union that you'd least suspect that a astrophysics major would ally him or herself with as anything other than the United Auto Workers Union? But anyway, they unionized a few years ago, and I said to my colleagues, the next thing they're going to do is strike, and it took a couple of years. Now they've been on strike for a month. And these are people, Dan, by the way, okay, look, I've never served in combat. My brother-in-law has, my best friends all have. They've been in battles, as I know you have. You get very close to your graduate students. You get close. My advisor came to my wedding, my PhD advisor, Peter Timby. He's been on my podcast. I did it, the Father's Day episode. You get very close to people that you spend 6 years with. During the day, you're spending 8 hours a day with potentially, and that you have this kind of, quasi-patriarchal, matriarchal relationship with. Now they're on strike. And so now they're not talking to me, and I can't talk to them because that'll be construed as extra labor negotiations. And I could get sued for that. And I wrote that. I said, F that. I'm going to invite you guys for Thanksgiving dinner, and you guys aren't getting paid. I'll give you a loan. I don't even care. Like, I'm not going to talk about your thesis or your research or going to Chile. I just want to see you. I want to make sure you're okay. You're like kind of like a kid. I mean, they're not my kids. I got enough kids. But you bond this thing, and then the union gets in the way, and they're on campus, and the only time I'll see them is they're striking. And you imagine your mother like going on strike against you. It's messed up. And that's like taking us so far away from things that professors had to worry about decades ago. And I support, they can use more money. It's hard to live in La Jolla, California, as you can imagine, but it's a challenge. And of course, I'm sympathetic to it. But by the same token, they're also getting training. They're learning how to become, PhD research scientists under an apprenticeship that I am leading. And I do so with great respect and awesome responsibility.
And this isn't a new thing being leveraged against them. This is how it's always been for everybody. I mean, the issue obviously is cost of living and inflation, not pay.
Correct.
That's
but the
almost always
funny
the
thing
case.
is that they're advocating. Okay, so 99% of academia is kind of left-wing Democrat who's allied with labor and so forth in union, and we have our own unions as professors, but they act, professors are acting like, are we like, members of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory of 1907? Like, is there going to be some fire that burn? Like, are we protesting against working conditions? But anyway, it's like Elon when he tweeted out about the New York Times strike that went on last week. And he said it's woke versus woke.
Yeah.
At least it's it's like the grad students, are protesting against the people that used to be graduate students. And we don't actually, I don't control how much a graduate student gets paid. It's set by the University of California, not just UCSD. And it's set at some level by the federal government, how much money, all the money I get. So the way academia works is that a department like physics or engineering gets a grant from the government or from a private agency. And they are taxed what's called overhead or indirect costs, IDC. And it could be as high as 56%. So every dollar, I give 56 cents to the campus. It's enormous. And that 56 cents goes for the philosophy department, the gender studies department, it goes to all the things that don't generate income for the campus. So it's not like I have all this money and I get to have a money fight, because with my other professors, we much of our money goes to overhead at the university, which is set by the university, who sets the salaries that the graduate students have. Anyway, all I'm saying is that these are science has changed. This wasn't the case 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and I do worry. I do worry about the kind of constant struggle to reveal the curiosity, because you don't really. I mean, you're interested in it because you're a curious person, but you're more curious about the science than the politics.
Right.
I'd rather just think about the science, but you can't. It's so impossible. In the past, you could. it was really possible. And maybe, as my podcast name goes, Into the Impossible, maybe we'll get back to it. But right now, it's less and less seeming likely, in my opinion.
Well, hopefully things will take a turn. I mean, it's usually under dire circumstances when people shut the fuck up and let things happen the way they're supposed to happen. So, hopefully we don't have to get that far down the rabbit hole for this to turn in the other direction. I do see a lot more. I mean, Twitter turning around, regardless of how you feel about Elon Musk, is definitely not a bad thing. And, just having the public sphere again to have these discussions and disagree with one another it seems like a useful thing to be able to disagree in public so the public can figure out who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah.
But, we'll see how it goes. I got to get going. We got to do another show here, but I really appreciate your time today and
anytime, man.
Updating us on all things science.
Let me give another plug for your
do it.
military heroes that are out there. These are meteorites, 4.3 billion years old, highly magnetic, made of exotic materials, unobtainium and vibranium. No, they're made of things you can find on the periodic table of the elements, and I'll send them to you guaranteed if you're an APO mailbox holder, or if you are a .edu. I know a lot of students listen to you. Just go to the link that's on the screen now, briankeating.com/list, join my mailing list, and make sure you use the proper address. Otherwise, you'll only have a part in 100% chance of winning.
Great.
Happy holidays, Dan.
Yeah, you too, buddy. Thank you very much for coming today, and thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.